creature had dismantled my chicken coop with uncanny precision. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in a tangled coat of black hair, and moved with a predatory intensity that froze me to the bone. I've replayed that recording hundreds of times since that October night, and each time only reinforces what I've been trying so hard to deny. I'm not crazy. They are real, and they've been watching me for far longer than I've known. My name is Robert Patrick, and this is the story of why I abandoned the only home I had ever known in my 63 years, why I fled into the night like a haunted man. What I'm about to share is not fiction. It's not the rambling of a lonely old farmer. That's why my house now stands empty in the wilds of Montana. I will never return to the land where 5 generations of Patricks lived. It's why I still sleep with the lights on in my son's apartment 3 states away, in the middle of a crowded city. For 42 years, Margaret and I built our lives on 127 acres of untamed land in the Bitterroot Mountains. Our closest neighbor was 18 miles away, down a dirt road that turned impassable for nearly 4 months each year. We raised cattle, grew our own vegetables, kept chickens for eggs, and heated the house with firewood. I spent countless days wandering the endless forest beyond our property line. It was the kind of self-sufficient life city people romanticize, but few have the grit to live. When Margaret passed 2 years ago, after a brief fight with cancer, our 3 children begged me to sell the ranch and move closer to civilization. Sarah, our eldest, is a successful attorney in Seattle. Michael works for an investment bank in Chicago, grinding through 80-hour weeks with little time for family. David, our youngest, runs a tech startup out of San Francisco, speaking in acronyms I can barely understand. They came for the funeral, stayed a week to help me settle Margaret's affairs, and then returned to their busy lives in their bustling cities. I understood their concern. Living alone on an isolated ranch at my age carried obvious risks. One heart attack, one bad fall, even a small accident could leave me helpless, unable to call for help. Cell service never reached our valley, and the landline had been knocked out by falling trees so many times I stopped counting. But that land was in my blood. My great-grandfather had settled there in 1887, and 4 generations of Patricks were buried in the small cemetery behind the house. Margaret's grave was the most recent, marked by a simple granite headstone carved with the words, "Beloved wife and mother." So I stayed. I tended the cattle, worked the garden, and kept a flock of 23 chickens, far more eggs than one man could eat. I traded the extras with the Kowalski family at their general store in Millerville, the nearest town 37 miles away. It was a quiet, predictable life, a life that suited me. I read books by lamplight, listened to old radio shows on a battery-powered set, and found peace in the rhythms of a rural existence that had sustained my family for over a century. But I wasn't naive about the dangers lurking in the wilderness. The Bitterroots were home to black bears, mountain lions, wolves, and every so often, a grizzly wandering down from Glacier National Park. I'd lost livestock before, a calf carried off by wolves, chickens slaughtered by foxes or raccoons. That was the price of life on the edge, where civilization ended and the true wilderness began. I always kept a loaded .30 .06 by the front door and an old .44 Magnum on my hip when I worked outside. Most predators give birth and raise their young just like we do, but hunger will turn any creature dangerous. The forest bordering my land was both a source of beauty and unease. Towering pines rose nearly 200 feet into the sky, their canopies so dense that noon felt like twilight beneath their branches. Animal trails crisscrossed the undergrowth, worn smooth by generations of deer, elk, and bears, traveling the same paths their ancestors had for millennia. I cut down deadfall for firewood and occasionally hunted at the forest's edge for venison, but I rarely dared go more than a quarter mile from the house. There was something in those deeper woods that felt wrong. A primal instinct told me to steer clear, to keep out of places where man was not welcome. Over the years, I'd heard sounds in those woods I could never explain. Sounds not quite animal, not quite human. Strange knocking echoes at odd hours, as if wood striking wood, carrying far through the trees. At times, I caught cries like those of great apes, yet threaded with an intelligence that raised every hair on my neck. Margaret would tell me it was nothing, just my imagination, or the natural voices of the wild. And I'd force myself to believe her. Every forest has its mysteries, its unexplained sounds. The mind plays tricks in the wilderness, especially through the endless winter months when isolation presses on the body like a physical weight. But after Margaret died, when the house fell into silence, save for the ticking of my grandmother's clock and the groan of old wood settling, I began to notice the forest sounds more keenly. Without Margaret's reasonable explanations to comfort me, the noises grew darker, more sinister. The calls came more often, patterned in ways that suggested communication. Sometimes they were answered by echoes from different directions. More unsettling were the heavy footsteps, deliberate, bipedal, that sometimes drifted out of the thickets long after dark. In that first summer alone, I began to find signs that something enormous was moving through the forest near my home. Giant tracks pressed deep into the soft earth by the creak prints far larger than anything a known animal could make. Bark stripped from trees at heights no bear could possibly reach. Stones and branches arranged with deliberate purpose, almost ritualistic in design. I told myself it was nature's accidents, coincidences, tricks of the mind. But then, at the end of July, came the first livestock killing. I found one of my young bulls dead in the pasture closest to the woods. Its neck was twisted at an angle that should have been impossible. The force required to snap the neck of an animal weighing close to 900 pounds was staggering. My first thought was that a grizzly had somehow taken it down, though I could find no claw marks, no tearing, none of the usual signs of a bear attack. Stranger still, the carcass hadn't been fed on. Predators kill to eat, not for sport. I dragged what was left deeper into the woods and tried to put it out of my mind. 2 weeks later, I lost 3 chickens in a single night. I found them scattered around the coop, not torn apart, not eaten, but killed with surgical precision. Their necks had been neatly broken, and their bodies arranged in a crude triangular pattern. Again, there were none of the usual signs of predation. No drag marks, no feeding, no tracks, or signs of forced entry. It was as if something had passed through the wire, killed them for the sheer purpose of killing, and left them behind like a message. After the chicken slaughter, I reinforced the coop with heavier gauge wire and added a padlock to the door. I also installed motion-activated floodlights around the house, hoping to scare off whatever was prowling my land. For the first few nights, the lights flared often, catching deer, elk, and other wildlife moving through the property. But over time, the nighttime activity faded. Either the animals had grown used to the light or something else was keeping them away. It was during this uneasy lull that Michael, my middle son, made an unexpected visit. He'd taken the rare step of requesting a week off from work, saying he just wanted to check in on his old man. Michael had never cared much for ranch life. He was more comfortable with video games and computers than with livestock or hay bales. But when it came to technology, he had a knack that always amazed me. When I told him about the livestock killings and my growing fears for security, he suggested setting up a trail camera to monitor the chickens. We drove into Millerville and picked up a high-end unit from the sporting goods store built for hunters, designed to capture both still photos and video whenever triggered by heat or movement. It had infrared night vision and could run for weeks on a set of lithium batteries. Michael spent an afternoon positioning the camera for the best coverage of the coop and its surroundings, then patiently showed me how to replay the footage on its small LCD screen. For the first month after Michael returned home, the camera caught exactly what I expected. Raccoons testing the wire, deer grazing along the fence line, an occasional fox nosing around. The nighttime parade of wildlife was almost comforting, a reminder that the ecosystem was still healthy and balanced. Slowly, I began to relax. I told myself whatever had killed my animals had moved on to easier hunting grounds. But as September gave way to October, and the nights grew longer and colder, something changed in the woods. The usual sounds of wildlife began to fade. In their place came a silence so heavy it pressed against the windows. Even the wind seemed different, whispering through the treetops in tones that made me double-check the locks on every door before bed. The cattle, once content to graze quietly across the pasture, began bunching together near the barn. They stood frozen for long stretches, eyes fixed on the tree line with an intensity that made the hair on my neck stand up as if they sensed something I could not. The first week of October brought an early frost that killed the last of my tomatoes and signaled the approach of winter. I spent my days splitting firewood, sealing the barns, and checking my stores of canned goods and cured meat. The work was familiar, grounding a ritual passed down through generations of Patricks who had all performed the same autumn chores before me. But as the nights fell earlier and darker, I found myself more aware of the sounds from the forest, sounds I couldn't explain or dismiss. The wood knocks had returned, now louder, echoing through the trees in complex rhythms like some kind of coded exchange. Sometimes a single knock would trigger a reply from deeper in the woods, only to be answered again from a different direction. The exchanges went on for an hour or more, as though multiple participants were engaged in some form of dialogue. I tried convincing myself it was just woodpeckers or branches falling, but the timing, the patterns, were too deliberate, too intentional. Worse were the calls. Deep, guttural cries somewhere between the worst aspects of human and animal speech. There was a consciousness in them, a deliberateness that turned my blood cold. These were not the random howls of wildlife. They were structured, carrying the cadence of language, even if I couldn't understand the meaning. More than once, I could have sworn I heard my name whispered from the darkness, in a voice too deep and unnatural to belong to any man. The trail camera began to pick up anomalies I couldn't explain. Massive shapes moving in the background, always too blurred or too fast to make out clearly. Heat signatures walking on two legs much larger than any human. Twice, the camera even caught what looked like glowing eyes reflecting the infrared flash. The eyes were set too high, far above the height of any known animal in this region. And what disturbed me most was how whatever it was seemed to be drawing closer. The first signs of activity appeared near the tree line, about 100 yards from the chicken coop. But as October wore on, the presence grew bolder, edging nearer to the house with each passing night. The footage began to show behavior that suggested intelligence, reconnaissance, as though something was studying me, learning my patterns, preparing for something I didn't dare let myself imagine. By the third week of October, I was sleeping with the .30-06 propped against the bed frame and the .44 Magnum within arm's reach. Every creak, every rustle outside triggered a surge of adrenaline that left me exhausted and half-mad with paranoia. I found myself checking the locks again and again, staring through the windows at shadows that might or might not hide a threat. The isolation that had once given me peace now felt like vulnerability. I was utterly alone, miles from help, staring down something that did not play by the rules of nature. The cattle abandoned the pastures closest to the woods, clustering around the barn even in broad daylight. Their behavior was unmistakable. They were afraid of something hiding in those trees. Animals possess senses we humans long ago dulled, instincts that still warn them of danger we can no longer perceive. And when prey shows fear that openly, the predator is never far away. I considered driving into town and staying at the motel until whatever stalked my land moved on. But this was my home, my family's land. To run would be to abandon everything my ancestors had built. It would be cowardice. Besides, I wasn't certain leaving would solve anything. Whatever was out there might just wait for me to return, or worse, follow me into town. At least here, I knew the terrain. I had defensible positions and the weapons I needed to protect myself. Staying would prove to be the most courageous and the most foolish decision of my life. The 23rd of October began like any other day. I fed the cattle, gathered eggs, and spent the afternoon splitting wood behind the barn. The air was cool but pleasant, the sky a sharp autumn blue with the kind of clarity you only get that time of year. Supper was simple venison stew and cornbread eaten while an old radio play crackled in the background. Later, I settled into my chair with a Louis L'Amour novel. Outside, the first stars appeared in a sky untouched by light pollution. Around 9 o'clock, I realized the silence had changed. There were no crickets, no owls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind had stilled, as if something living pressed its weight against the windows. The cattle were nowhere to be seen. Likely they had crowded inside the barn, where they had been spending more and more of their time. The quiet was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, the ticking of Margaret's old clock, and the faint groan of ancient timbers settling in the house. I walked the rooms once more, checked the locks on both doors, tested the windows, and made sure every weapon was loaded and within reach. That morning, the trail cam's battery indicator showed full, so I knew it had captured everything that happened in the night. Part of me hoped the footage would prove my fears unfounded, that I was just an old man letting his imagination get the better of him. But deeper down, something more primal screamed warnings I could not ignore. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of hulking shapes moving through the woods, of eyes glowing from the darkness. I woke several times convinced I'd heard something outside. Each time, the night was silent. The last thing I remembered was glancing at the alarm clock on the nightstand, 2:17 a.m. Before exhaustion finally pulled me into heavier sleep, I awoke into a silence deeper than anything I had ever known. There were no morning bird song, no soft footfalls of cattle grazing, no stirrings of the wild beginning its day. Pale dawn filtered through the bedroom curtains, illuminating specks of dust dancing in the still air. Something was wrong terribly, fundamentally wrong. The kitchen window that looked out toward the chicken coop framed a sight that stopped my heart. The wire mesh had been peeled back as if it were nothing but tinfoil, curled into neat strips by a force both immense and precise. The wooden frame remained intact, but inside was a slaughterhouse. Feathers swirled in the morning breeze, black stains smeared across the ground in patterns that could only be blood. Broken bodies lay scattered through the coop and across the yard. Some were partially eaten, but most had been killed in abandoned murder for sport, not survival. The night before, 23 chickens had gone into the coop. Now only 4 remained alive, cowering beneath a toppled water trough, too stunned to flee. This was no fox or raccoon, which might take 1 or 2 birds at a time. This was systematic destruction, carried out with a cruelty that made my blood run cold. But it was the footage from the trail cam that shattered my last shred of rationality, replacing it with a reality darker than any nightmare. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the playback, skimming past hours of routine activity in search of the moment hell came to my land. The early evening showed nothing unusual. A herd of deer grazed near the fence line, a raccoon tested the defenses, an owl swooped across the frame on silent wings. Normal, ordinary, safe. Then, at 11:47 p.m., the darkness at the edge of the forest began to move. The infrared lens revealed what no human eye could pierce in that blackness. A massive, humanoid figure emerged from the brush, moving with a fluid grace completely at odds with its immense size. It stood close to 9 feet tall. Its body was cloaked in black hair that seemed to swallow the infrared glow. The proportions were all wrong. Arms hanging nearly to its knees, shoulders so broad they could have filled a doorway, its head set low against them with no visible neck. But it wasn't the size or the strength of the thing that terrified me most. It was the intelligence in the way it moved. This was no dumb beast driven only by hunger or instinct. The creature approached the coop with purpose, pausing to study the wire before dismantling my defenses with methodical precision. Its hands, and they were hands, not paws or claws, worked with the precision of a craftsman. It peeled back the heavy-gauge wire as easily as I might tear paper, creating an opening wide enough for its massive frame to slip through. What followed was 30 minutes of frenzied slaughter. The creature killed swiftly, efficiently snapping necks with casual gestures that revealed terrifying physical power. But it wasn't just feeding. This was destruction for the sake of destruction. The monster killed far more than it could eat, leaving most of the carcasses untouched, selecting only choice parts. At times, it seemed to revel in the carnage, pausing to survey its work before continuing the massacre. Then came the moment that froze me to the core. The creature looked straight at the camera. Its eyes flared in the infrared like burning coals, and for one endless heartbeat, I felt certain it was staring at me through the lens. The intelligence in that gaze was unmistakable. It knew it was being recorded, and it didn't care. If anything, it seemed to perform for the camera, demonstrating its strength, its dominance, as if for my benefit. When it was finished, it gathered a few of the bodies and melted back into the forest with the same fluid grace it had shown upon arrival. The timestamp read 12:23 a.m. when the final traces of movement slipped from view. The entire attack had lasted 36 minutes. I replayed the footage 3 more times before the full weight of what I'd seen finally settled into my stunned mind. Sasquatch, Bigfoot. Whatever name folklore has given to that legend of the Pacific Northwest, it was real, and it had hunted on my land, studied my patterns, and waited until the perfect moment to strike. The implications were staggering. If creatures like this stalked the deep wilderness, how many people had crossed their paths over the years? How many disappearances in national forests and remote backcountry could be explained not by accidents, but by predators science refuses to acknowledge? And the most terrifying thought of all struck me at once. If this thing had been watching me for weeks, maybe months, learning my habits, what did it plan to do next? The nearest phone was at the Kowalski's General Store in Millerville, 37 miles of rough mountain road, over an hour's drive. But I knew I had to report what I had seen, to get help before the creature returned. I mounted the trail camera on the seat of my old Ford pickup, double-checked that both rifles were secured in the gun rack, and set out on the long drive toward town. Millerville was nothing more than a general store, a gas pump, a post office, and a couple dozen houses scattered along the main road. The Kowalski family had run that little store for 3 generations, serving ranchers and loggers scattered across the remote valleys. They knew everyone within 50 miles and had heard every tall tale the mountains could whisper. If anyone was going to believe my story, it would be them. But when I showed Tom Kowalski the trail cam footage, his reaction was nothing like I expected. He played the recording twice, shaking his head and muttering under his breath. When the creature turned and stared directly into the camera, Tom actually recoiled from the tiny screen, as if it might reach through and grab him. Finally, he told me I should call the U.S. Forest Service Ranger Station down in Hamilton, 40 miles south. If something dangerous was prowling the wilderness, he said, the rangers needed to know. They had the training and the tools to deal with predators. Tom even offered me the store's landline to make the call. The conversation with the Hamilton Ranger was brief and humiliating. He listened politely enough as I described the livestock killings and the creature I'd captured on film. But the moment I used the word Bigfoot, his tone shifted. The patience in his voice turned syrupy, patronizing the kind reserved for children and the senile. He suggested I'd probably recorded a bear standing on its hind legs, distorted by shadows and light. When I insisted the creature had walked upright, displayed intelligence, and was clearly no bear, the patience evaporated altogether. He told me the Forest Service dealt with real wildlife management issues, not cryptozoology fantasies. If I had trouble with predators, I should call state fish and game. And if isolation and grief were affecting my mental health, I should seek appropriate medical care. The line went dead with a click that echoed through the quiet of the store like a gunshot. Tom's expression shifted as the call unfolded from concerned to embarrassed to something like pity. He'd known me for 20 years, had traded with my family even longer, yet now he looked at me as though I'd lost my mind. When he gently suggested that maybe the strain of living alone was catching up with me, that perhaps I should consider moving closer to my children, I knew I was truly alone. The drive back to the ranch felt endless. Every shadow under the trees seemed capable of hiding a predator taller than a man. Every flicker in my peripheral vision sent adrenaline surging, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. What had once been my strength solitude now felt like a death sentence. I was completely alone, face to face with something that existed outside the accepted boundaries of reality. Something both intelligent and malicious. When the house finally came into view, my stomach dropped. The pastures were empty, the cattle were gone. Even the area around the barn looked abandoned, unnaturally still. Either the herd had wandered off in search of better grazing, or something had driven them into the deepest parts of the forest. Based on what I'd already seen, I feared the latter. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of mounting dread and sleepless nights. I rebuilt the destroyed chicken coop into something closer to a fortress than a farm enclosure, thick-gauge wire, double locks, motion sensors wired to floodlights. Every defense I could devise. But deep down, I knew it was only symbolic. If the creature decided to strike again, no amount of steel or barbed wire would stop it. I reset the trail camera to cover a wider area, hoping to catch the creature's return and maybe learn something about its behavior. The footage painted a picture of land under siege. Enormous tracks appeared in the mud around the watering trough. The trees at the forest's edge showed heavy damage, bark stripped at heights no man could reach without a ladder. Most disturbing of all were the arrangements of stones and sticks that appeared overnight. Clear geometric patterns, deliberate and purposeful. The creature was still out there, still watching, still plotting something I could not comprehend. Every shadow might conceal a 9-foot predator. Every sound from the woods could herald another attack. I found myself jumping at the smallest creak of the old timbers, every gust of wind against the porch. Sleep became impossible without chemical help, and even then, nightmares jolted me awake several times a night. The cattle were truly gone, whether driven off by terror or dragged into the forest, I couldn't say. What I did find were bones scattered in the woods, ribs cleaned of meat, leg bones cracked open for marrow. No sign of scavengers. The destruction was too thorough, too efficient to be the work of natural predators. Something with intelligence equal to our own was dismantling my herd piece by piece, and I was powerless to stop it. Food became a constant worry. The few surviving hens gave me eggs, and I still had plenty of canned goods and preserved meat. But with winter closing in, it meant more trips into town than I cared to risk. Each drive to Millerville felt like running a gauntlet, the forest pressing in on both sides of the narrow road. I caught myself driving faster than was safe, desperate to reach the false security of civilization. The isolation was wearing me down. Without Margaret to steady me, I felt myself slipping toward paranoia, maybe even madness. I talked to myself constantly, filling the silence with old radio programs and scratchy music recordings. anything to hold back the suffocating quiet that invited darker thoughts. The house that had sheltered 5 generations now felt like a prison. Walls or wire meant nothing against an intelligence watching from the tree line. I began to draft a contingency plan. If things grew worse, I would abandon the ranch and drive to Chicago to stay with Michael. The thought of leaving family land to whatever lurked in those woods gnawed at me, but survival outweighed sentiment. I kept a bag packed with essentials, the truck's tank topped off, and I practiced the quickest route to the highway. But I had waited too long to act. Something in the forest was growing bolder, more brazen. My time was running out. The 7th of November broke gray and bitter, the air tinged with the scent of coming snow, storm clouds piling over the peaks. I hadn't slept well, roused by noises in the night, maybe branches breaking, or maybe something far worse moving among the trees. The trail cam battery had died overnight, so I spent the morning replacing it with fresh lithium cells and adjusting the angle for a wider view of the yard. As evening fell, the sense of impending disaster grew unbearable. Every instinct honed over 6 decades in the wilderness screamed warnings I could no longer ignore. The forest was too still, the air too still, the darkness too thick. Even the wind had died, a suffocating silence that reminded me of the moments before a tornado strikes. I checked my weapons for the 100th time, confirmed the truck keys were still in my pocket, and rehearsed the escape plan again. If anything happened that night, I'd grab my bag and run for the pickup without looking back. The ranch could be rebuilt. My life could not, if I lost it to whatever was stalking me from the tree line. Darkness dropped like a curtain. Soon after, the familiar wood knocking began echoing across the forest. But tonight the rhythm was different, faster, sharper, urgent. Knocks came in rapid succession, immediately answered by others from multiple directions. Whatever was out there was communicating with its own kind, coordinating something. By 10 o'clock the calls started, deep, guttural cries that raised the hair on my neck and sent primal terror racing down my spine. These were not random animal noises. They had structure, intent, intelligence, a language but not one of men. I counted at least 3 distinct voices, maybe more, which meant a group had gathered in the woods encircling my home. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, measured pacing around the house at about 50 yards. I tracked the sounds from window to window, catching fleeting movement beyond the reach of my security lights. They were probing my defenses, testing for weakness. The footsteps would halt for long stretches, then resume from another direction, tightening the circle, closing in. By 11, I knew I was in real danger. Shapes shifted in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the floodlights. Huge figures on 2 legs, moving with unnerving grace for their size. When one of them stepped briefly into the glow, I caught a glimpse of dark fur and eyes gleaming like polished metal. That was enough. I grabbed my bag, made sure the .44 Magnum was snug in its holster, and crept toward the back door where my truck waited. The keys slipped in my sweat-slick hands as I fumbled with the lock, every second expecting to hear glass shatter or wood splinter as the creatures finally struck. By some small miracle, the pickup roared to life on the first turn of the key. That sound may have saved me. I threw it into reverse, backing away from the house without switching on the headlights, navigating by the faint glow of the dashboard alone. When I was 30 yards from the house, I flicked on the headlights and saw them. 2 massive figures emerged from the trees, striding steadily toward the farmhouse. In the beams of the truck, they were far more terrifying than anything the trail camera had ever captured. At least 9 feet tall, their bodies were matted in tangled black hair, their proportions radiating raw physical power. Their eyes reflected the light like mirrors, and every movement carried an unmistakable intelligence, deliberate, calculating. They stopped when the headlights caught them, then turned to stare directly at me through the windshield. For a moment that stretched into eternity, predator and prey regarded one another across the 30 yards of open ground. Then one of them raised an arm, not a paw, but a hand with a thumb, and pointed straight at me. The gesture was unmistakably human, intentionally threatening, and it froze the blood in my veins. I slammed the accelerator and tore down the ranch road without looking back. In the rearview mirror, I saw them still standing in the glare of the headlights, watching my retreat, until the darkness swallowed them. I didn't breathe normally again until I hit the main road through the forest. Even then, my hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the wheel. The 37 miles to Millerville had never felt longer. Every shadow beneath the trees seemed capable of hiding another hunter. Every bend in the road could reveal something blocking my path. Twice, I thought I saw shapes moving in the tree-line, towering figures, keeping pace with the truck, gliding through the rough terrain as if it were nothing. But whenever I slowed to get a better look, they vanished into the dark like smoke. I reached Millerville at 12:47 a.m., according to the clock on the post office. The town lay silent, its few street lamps casting pale islands of light against the wilderness beyond. I pulled into the gas station and sat for several minutes, letting my heart settle. The sight of sidewalks and storefronts, however humble, felt like salvation after the primal terror of the forest road. Tom Kowalski lived in a small house behind the store. I hated to wake him at that hour, but I needed human contact. I needed a voice of reason to anchor me to reality. When he answered my frantic knocking, wearing a bathrobe and glaring with irritation, I must have looked like a madman, eyes wild, sweat soaking my shirt despite the cold, babbling about creatures in the woods and narrow escapes. But Tom saw the fear written on me. He brought me inside, poured coffee, and listened while I recounted the night's events. When I finished, he sat in silence for a long time, studying my face as though deciding whether I was lying, delusional, or simply broken. At last, he suggested I drive to Hamilton in the morning, check into a motel, and stay there until I could make longer-term arrangements. I spent the remainder of the night in Tom's living room, sleepless. Every sound outside the wind hissing through the trees, the distant hum of a car on the highway sent adrenaline surging through me. By the time dawn broke, gray and bitter, I felt as though I'd aged a decade in a single night. The mirror in Tom's bathroom showed a stranger's face, sunken eyes, deep lines carved across my skin that hadn't been there the day before. The drive to Hamilton took 2 hours, winding through mountain passes that would have been breathtaking under any other circumstances. But every mile of wilderness carried a weight of dread. Every forest seemed to harbor things that should not exist. Only when I reached the outskirts of Hamilton with its suburban homes, chain restaurants, and streetlights did the knot in my chest begin to ease. I checked into the Ponderosa Motel and spent the day trying to reach my children by phone. Michael was in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. Sarah was tied up in court and didn't return my call until evening. David was traveling on business and might not even receive my messages for days. I had lived independently for 63 years, but in that motel room, for the first time in my life, I felt utterly weak and alone. When Sarah finally called back that night, I tried to explain what had happened without sounding insane. I told her about the cattle slaughter, the strange sounds in the woods, and my decision to leave the ranch for now. I did not mention Sasquatch. I did not mention the trail cam footage. Some truths are too dangerous to share. Sarah sighed with relief when I admitted I couldn't live alone on the ranch forever. She offered to fly out immediately and help me relocate. Within a week, I was in Michael's guest room in a high-rise in downtown Chicago, surrounded by the clamor of the city. The adjustment was brutal in its own way. Too many people, too much concrete, not enough sky. But at night, when the city lights kept the darkness at bay and voices echoed through the hallways, I felt safe for the first time in months. I spent 8 months in Chicago before I finally worked up the courage to return. Michael had urged me to sell the land outright, to cut ties, to bury the past, to embrace civilization. But 127 acres of Montana wilderness wasn't just property. It was my life's work, my family's legacy. I couldn't abandon it without at least retrieving my belongings, Margaret's keepsakes, our heirlooms, the memories bound up in that house. The drive west felt like traveling backward through time. Each mile took me farther from the safety of the city and deeper into the wilderness that had nearly claimed my life. When at last I turned down the ranch road in early July, my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the wheel. But I had to know what had become of my home. I had to face whatever still waited for me. The house was still standing, but just barely. What I found defied every explanation, every assumption about the limits of nature's fury. It looked less like weather damage and more like the aftermath of deliberate destruction. The front porch had been ripped from its foundation, support posts snapped like twigs, windows shattered outward as if something powerful had struck them from inside. The front door dangled from a single hinge, its heavy oak planks split and gouged by what could only have been claws or massive fingers. Inside, the devastation was worse. Furniture had been smashed to kindling, strewn across the rooms like the aftermath of an explosion. The kitchen table where Margaret and I had shared meals for 40 years was reduced to splinters. My grandmother's china cabinet lay toppled, its delicate porcelain ground to powder beneath enormous feet. Even the cast iron stove had been toppled, its chimney ripped from the ceiling and twisted into angles no storm could produce. But it was the deliberate nature of the destruction that froze my blood. This wasn't random vandalism. It wasn't the chaos of weather. Every family photograph had been smashed, frames torn apart, the images shredded and scattered across the rooms like confetti. Margaret's jewelry box had been pried open, its contents dumped carelessly across the bedroom floor. Nothing stolen, only ruined, as though destruction itself had been the point. Books that had belonged to my family for generations lay ripped to pieces, their pages carpeting the living room like a snowfall of words. The staircase to the second floor had been wrenched from the wall, leaving jagged splinters where once stood a beautifully hand-carved banister. Upstairs, the bedrooms had been systematically gutted. My clothes were shredded, drawers yanked out and hurled into the walls. Even the mattresses had been torn open, stuffing scattered across the rooms like the claw marks of some colossal beast. It was in Margaret's old sewing room that I found the evidence that chilled me to the marrow. Handprints. Enormous handprints pressed into the plaster walls, every finger distinct, as if a giant had leaned into the soft gypsum. They were twice the size of my own hands, with a wingspan that seemed almost impossible. Worse than their size was their placement. Some prints sat 8 feet off the floor. Others were smeared against the ceiling itself, as though whatever made them had crawled along the walls and across the roof like some monstrous spider. The basement revealed the final horror. My workshop, where I had spent countless hours crafting furniture, repairing tools, and keeping alive the trades of my father and grandfather, was annihilated. Tools that had served my family for generations were twisted into unrecognizable shapes. My father's anvil, weighing over 200 pounds, had been hurled across the room with such force it embedded 6 inches into the concrete wall. My oak workbench, built from a single solid slab, had been pulverized into fragments no bigger than toothpicks. This was no accident. This was no animal. This was intelligence paired with strength on a scale I could scarcely imagine, but it was what I found in the corner that finally broke me. Margaret's headstone, the simple granite marker of her final resting place, lay shattered across the basement floor. The creatures had desecrated the dead, violated the one thing I still held sacred. Rage and grief surged through me, and I collapsed among the broken fragments that bore my wife's name. The message was clear. This was punishment. Punishment for running, for abandoning the territory they had claimed as their own. They had taken everything: my home, my possessions, my memories, even the stone that marked Margaret's grave. The life Robert Patrick had built was reduced to rubble, and with it the bitter knowledge that some battles cannot be won. I spent less than an hour in that ruin, gathering what little remained untouched by the systematic destruction. Margaret's wedding ring, miraculously preserved beneath a pile of torn photographs, a family Bible, half buried in the chaos. My grandfather's .30-06 rifle, snapped in two but still recognizable. As I prepared to leave for the last time, I saw fresh tracks in the dirt outside the house. Massive, clear, only a few days old. They were still watching me, still studying, waiting from the safety of the trees. The thought that they might be planning another encounter sent me fleeing to the truck, panic clawing at my chest. The drive back to Chicago was a blur of relief and despair. Relief that I had escaped with my life. Grief for everything I had lost. The destruction of the house was devastating, but the desecration of Margaret's grave was worse than any material loss. These creatures were not only intelligent and powerful, they were cruel. They possessed a malice that seemed woven into their very being. I never reported what happened. How could I? How could I explain that my home had been destroyed by beings that don't exist? The insurance company would demand a cause: wind, vandalism, fire. None of those fit. I was left alone with knowledge I could not share, could not prove, and could not escape. Michael was stunned when I appeared again at his apartment door. My short trip to Montana had aged me visibly, carving new lines into my face, sinking my eyes into hollows of exhaustion and grief. When he asked about the ranch, I told him the house had been badly damaged. Weather, vandals, the costs of repair far exceeding its value. The lie slipped out too easily. But the truth would have destroyed what little credibility I had left. The following week, Sarah flew to Chicago to help finalize the sale. A realtor who specialized in remote properties handled the listing without ever setting foot on the land, marketing it as an ideal retreat for those who wanted to live in the wild. The asking price was set low enough to draw immediate interest, and within 2 months, the paperwork was signed over to a young couple from California. They dreamed of building a sustainable farm on the land. I never warned them about the creatures in the woods. How could I? They would have dismissed my words as the ramblings of an old man, just as the ranger had months before. And besides, maybe the things in those forests would leave new owners alone, respecting boundaries different from the ones they had carved into my family. It was a coward's hope, but it was hope all the same. The sale gave me enough to buy a modest condo on the outskirts of Chicago, close enough to Michael's family that I could visit often, yet independent enough to preserve a shred of dignity. I filled my days volunteering at the local library, helping visitors trace family histories and research old records. The work kept me occupied, gave me social connections, and helped ease the isolation that had nearly destroyed me back in Montana. But nights were harder. City sounds, the sirens, the rush of cars, the rumble of the elevated train could not blot out the memory of those forests, echoing with silence and knocks in the night. Every shadow between the buildings seemed to stir with hulking shapes under moonlight. Sleep came only with the help of prescription pills that dulled me into a heavy fog and left me disconnected in the mornings. It has been 3 years since I left the ranch to whatever claimed it from the wilderness. In that time, I've learned how to live in a world that has no place for the truth I carry. I smile and nod when people call Sasquatch a folktale. I change the subject smoothly when television shows treat mysterious encounters as entertainment. I've become skilled at silence. But I still follow the news from Montana with an obsession I cannot shake, scanning for any sign that the creatures have expanded their territory or claimed new victims. Last spring, a backpacker disappeared in Glacier National Park, under circumstances officials could not explain. His campsite was found destroyed, his gear scattered across a wide area, but his body was never recovered. The official report blamed a bear attack, but the descriptions of the wreckage brought back memories I cannot forget. And then, 6 months ago, I got an unexpected call from Tom Kowalski in Millerville. The young couple who bought my ranch hadn't lasted a year. They abandoned the property and fled to Seattle. They had told neighbors about strange sounds coming from the woods, about livestock vanishing overnight, about equipment mysteriously destroyed. When Tom repeated their stories to me, I felt a chilling familiarity. The creatures were still there, still guarding their territory, still driving away anyone who dared settle too close to their domain. The ranch sits empty now, officially for sale, but drawing no serious buyers. Local realtors whisper that the land is cursed, that families who try to live there never last. The asking price keeps dropping every few months, yet even the most desperate buyers seem to sense something is wrong. Perhaps animals do have instincts that warn them away from a predator's hunting ground. Perhaps some truths are too dangerous to ignore, even when reason demands we dismiss them. I saved the trail cam footage to a digital drive hidden in the back of my bedroom closet. It is the only evidence of what I witnessed that October night. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I watch it again, those burning eyes reflecting in the lens, the deliberate cruelty in every movement. The creature knew it was being recorded. It wanted me to see what it was capable of. It wanted me to understand that I survived only because it allowed me to, that I was living in its territory by its permission alone. Michael worries for my sanity. He suggests therapy, convinced that what haunts me is trauma from losing the family ranch. Sarah calls every week to check on me, urging me to find new activities, to ease into city life. David sends postcards and emails from his business trips, photos of faraway places where the closest thing to wilderness is a manicured city park. They are good children, thoughtful and kind, but they live in a world where monsters exist only in movies and family legends. I've considered writing it all down, creating a full account, a record to warn future victims or help researchers understand what hides in the deep wilderness. But who would believe such a story? Scientists dismiss mysterious encounters as mistakes, myths, or lies. Law enforcement sees reports like mine as evidence of mental instability. Even my own family might treat a written confession as proof that isolation and grief had finally pushed me into full delusion. So I remain silent and burdened with a knowledge heavier with each passing year. Somewhere in the mountains of western Montana, intelligent predators guard a territory that humans trespass at their own peril. They possess the cunning to evade detection by science and the strength to eliminate any threat to their domain. They remember faces, they hold grudges, and they carry out vengeance with a precision that reveals an intelligence equal to or greater than our own. The trail cam footage didn't just capture an animal raiding my chicken coop. It captured the existence of beings that defy everything we think we know about the natural world. creatures embodying the worst qualities of both man and beast, patient, calculating, and merciless in protecting what they consider theirs. I was lucky to escape alive. The young couple who tried to take my place was lucky enough to recognize the danger before it was too late. But others will not be so quick. The wilderness is vast, and these creatures have learned to exploit human arrogance and skepticism to their advantage. They know we won't believe the survivors. They know we won't take precautions against threats science refuses to acknowledge. And so, every time I see news of a missing hiker or a disappearance in some remote corner of the country, I wonder, is another family about to endure what I faced on that October night? I wonder if, even now, ancient eyes are watching from the shadows, calculating the perfect moment to strike. The thought that I could warn them that I might save someone presses on my conscience like a physical weight. But who would listen to an old man's story of monsters in the woods? Who would believe that something out of nightmares walks on two legs through the forests, leaving footprints too large for any known species, and wielding an intelligence too sharp for any beast? Science has already decided. So the footage remains hidden, 36 minutes locked away in the back of my closet. 36 minutes of proof that this world is far stranger and far more dangerous than most are willing to accept. Perhaps one day I will find the courage to share it with someone I can trust, someone with the authority and resources to investigate. But until that day, I live with the knowledge that in the wild places of this world, there are beings who do not see us as rulers of this planet. They see us as prey. The house where 5 generations of Patricks once lived now stands empty. Its windows are dark, its doors secured against nothing more than weather and vandals. But the forest surrounding it holds something older, something more cunning than we are. Creatures that have learned to exist in the gap between human knowledge and human belief. I survived my encounter with the unknown, but I will never truly escape it. Every night, when I turn off the lights in the safety of my suburban apartment, I hear them again, the heavy footfalls pacing around the house. Every shadow reminds me of hulking forms gliding beneath the moonlight with a predator's grace. Every unexplained sound in the dark calls back the memory of those woods, echoing with secret messages passed between beings mankind refuses to acknowledge. The trail cam recorded the truth that October night. The question that haunts me is whether anyone will ever accept what it reveals. Whether our species has the courage to admit we share this world with intelligences that learn to hunt us long before we learn to hunt them. Deep in the wilderness, where cell phones fail and help is days away, ancient predators still claim territories no human map has ever charted correctly. They watch from the trees, patient, calculating, waiting for the next family bold enough to build too close to their borders. And when that family comes, armed with the confidence of modern technology and scientific certainty, they will learn what I learned in the western mountains of Montana. Some legends are true. Some monsters walk on 2 legs, and some truths are far too dangerous for civilized society to accept. The footage remains. The creatures remain. And somewhere out there, in the wilderness, they are still watching, still waiting, still guarding the land we trespass at our peril. My name is Robert Patrick, and this is why I will never go home again.